Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today I am so delighted to have the leader, the CEO, the director of the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada, Josh Basseches. Josh, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience with us. I'm so delighted to have you here.
Well, Mark, it's terrific to be here and glad to be part of the Nonprofit Report, and I look forward to a good discussion.
We have known each other for quite a while. Sometimes I go back and I think, oh my God, how time flies when you're having fun. And you've led a number of different institutions, the Royal Ontario Museum, over the last 10 years. I have seen an amazing transformation. I've been a helper to you for some of that, but I'd like to go back to when you first started talking, even before you visited and you had your interviews. I'd like to go back to your perceptions of the Royal Ontario Museum before you really started the job in those early days, and then we'll take a look at where you are right now, because there's been quite a transformation that has been enabled by yourself, your board, your team, your various teams of the community. But let's go all the way back. What were your initial perceptions of the Royal Ontario Museum before you took the reins of the organization?
Well, it's interesting, Mark. You're right. We've known each other for a long time, so I do remember talking with you about the opportunity even before I began. And what I have always felt about the museum, and certainly from the get-go when I was initially looking at the institution, is an amazing museum with this remarkable century-long history, one of the great collections of the world, a tremendous curatorial team, great building right on the corner of two of the most important intersections in Toronto. And of course, the Michael Leachin Crystal had been built only a little bit before I got here, designed by Daniel Libeskind, which talked about an institution that was aspirational. It talked about an institution that was looking forward, and that was one of the attractions. What I would also say is I felt like it was an institution that was already great, but could be greater. And a lot of that had to do with how you take these exceptional, I'll call them assets, the assets of this museum, the sort of the ones I'm talking about, building, collections, staff, reputation, and how you help to make a museum have a role in both our local community and, frankly, on a global basis, that makes the museum a center, a hotbed of exciting exchange, a place of curiosity and wonder. And so I actually went back recently. I'm sort of in the last couple of weeks of my 10 years. And one of the things that I did recently was go back and look at my very first major speech to the donors and boards of the museum. And it was interesting to me because at that moment, I laid out many of the ideas and issues that, frankly, we've followed throughout that period of time, and really, I think, had some progress in bringing the museum forward. And I remember saying at that time, so that was 2016, what does it mean to be a great museum in the 21st century? And frankly, even though we were already 16 years into the century, museums have been, and in some cases still are, wrestling with that. And I think back over time, and as museums, we've always been focused on the issues of excellence, excellent collections, excellent staff, excellent donors, you name it. Excellence is very, very important. But sometimes we can be a little bit internal looking. I mean, I sometimes talk about museums, and Rom could be said in one of that, they were doing a little bit of navel gazing. We may have hundreds of thousands of people come through our doors, but are we focused on what engages the public, what excites the public, what ensures that we are relevant to the public? And I think those words, engagement and relevance, need to sit on top of the idea of excellence and really drive forward what we're doing. I could go on forever on this, but I'm going to pause so you can actually ask me questions.
Well, to me, that is the key thing. That is the key ingredient that you brought to the museum. It wasn't that you brought a change. You brought a whole bunch of questions. And it's sort of a Josh Basseches style. You ask inciting question, then you engage people in the answers. You don't pretend that you have all the answers yourself. And one of the key questions you posed, and it was one of the challenges in our work together, was what is our relationship to the audience and who is the audience? Who is coming in the door and who should be coming in the door? Who is not coming in the door but would really enjoy that experience, right? How do you make them welcome? Even the Liebenskind entryway, how that actually functioned to create a welcoming environment. Those questions, I think, were key. When you're thinking about a museum and transition a museum like this, which scale with collections with fabulous curators, from being inwardly focused to being outwardly focused, to taking that expertise and not just using that expertise to talk with other experts, but to talk with the public. How do you start to create that culture shift within the organization and have that change happen from the people on out, the people within the museum on out to the people outside of the museum?
Well, we talk a lot about visitor centrism. And how can we be a place that is engaged and focused on the visitor? And what I've said to our team, that doesn't just mean the visitor services staff or the security guards or the frontline staff that are engaging with the public. If you are a curator, if you are an educator, if you are a conservator, you have to be thinking about what difference does what I do make to the people that we want to engage. And I remember sitting in meetings of exhibitions. So we've built a really dynamic exhibition team. So whether it's, right now in our institution, you can go from an amazing natural history show called Sharks to an exhibition called Saints and Sinners, Lovers and Fools, 300 Years of Flemish Masterworks. So we're going from a really refined painting show to something about the natural world and the environment and sharks in particular. But whatever it is, I remember in those early days sitting in conversations with curators, designers, interpretive developers. Somebody would bring an exhibition idea forward, and it became almost a joke internally. I'd say, so why should I care if I'm a member of the public? And what we'd call it the so what question. Okay, that's great, curator A or curator B. I know you're really interested in that. I'm interested in it too. But why should other people care? And the mission statement that we developed in those early years that still resonates for me and is very powerful and guides our work is to say our mission is to transform lives by helping people understand the past, make sense of the present, and come together to shape a shared future. And right there, it encapsulates that set of ideas. First of all, it starts with the notion that we're not just here to give people facts or to do, modest education, but our aspiration, our goal is to say, transform lives. That might happen sometimes in big ways, where someone leaves with a whole different perception of themselves in the world, or maybe small ways. It is, transformations and epiphanies can be little and big, but it says we believe that we have the capacity to make that type of a difference. So that's a starting place. And then from there, we go on to say we have this whole arc of time. And whether you're doing an exhibition on, as we do here, ancient Nubia, or whether you're doing it on contemporary African art, we have to ask, how do we connect people to those stories? How do they matter? And also, by the way, how do we accept that there are all sorts of different types of knowledge and expertise? And we, the museum, or our curators, do not have a corner on the market about insight and experience.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the ROM is the breadth of its collections. I mean, it's got one of the world's great collections of meteorites. I mean, who knew, right? You have natural materials, right, from the natural world, which can be actually used to contextualize some of the art, particularly the arts of people who lived in close proximity to that natural world, the First Peoples arts, and to give a sense of how people lived in those times. When you're looking at programming and you're thinking about a family coming in, a couple kids, parents, grandparents, you have different interests, right? It's possible that the grandparents are going to be a little bit differently interested than the kids, but they want to be there for the kids. And meanwhile, they're infecting their children with their interests. How do you create experiences that people want to have and have again and have again? You know, in terms of your special exhibitions, are you thinking in terms of a portfolio of different experiences for these different audience members with their different interests? Or is this all coming out of a particular season or a sensibility? How do you actually think about your today's events, like the thing that people are going to experience today and what they can experience? How do you knit that together?
Well, there's a lot to talk about on that front. And I'll start by saying, in coming into the museum, we do have this very broad range of collections. So we have about 1 million works of art and culture and 17 million natural history specimens within the museum. So this incredible collection has great depth in, whether it's, as we say, dinosaurs to Egypt, contemporary Chinese art to ancient bronzes, Roman busts to European decorative arts. I mean, you name it. And that's part of what drew me here. But first of all, it was very diverse, and it was hard for people to understand what we do, who we are, what we are. So one of the first things I did is I simplified all that to say, we're a museum of art, culture, and nature. Three phrases, three areas, which immediately help people to say, okay, I get the breadth and I get the depth and I understand some of the interconnectivity. And we also have been very committed to saying, not only how do we be sort of the equivalent of two separate museums, an art museum and a natural history museum in one, but how do we take advantage of that breadth to actually create something that is more fabulous than if we were just, one disciplinary museum or another. And we have about 100 staff in the curatorial and collections area and about 35 full curators. And we really push them to say, how do you work across these different areas, so that we just did a collection on climate change, but it's also looking at the impact on climate change on humanity, and then also has artistic representation that connects with those areas.
And the thing that I really liked about how, at least I've experienced some of your exhibitions, is that you kind of take a different perspective approach, where you can look at, for example, through history, how First Nations peoples have viewed their art and have created their art and have viewed the exhibiting of their art, right? So you have that voice and different voices from First Nations peoples, but you also have kind of the institution of the University of Toronto. You also have civic institutions. You have these different perspectives, and you can take a look at one object or one exhibition, and you seem to have some sort of a gift of unpacking that from different perspectives. And I can't really describe the magic that you all do, but am I getting that right?
You absolutely nailed it. How do we present? And then that phrase, presenting material from multiple perspectives, was in that very first speech that I described. Oh. By the way, it is a team effort, and there's a lot of talent here, but we try to bring that talent together. And we also say that different skill sets within the museum can engage to create more exciting things. But I'll tell you one example that I'll highlight is our major show that we undertook, that we presented, that closed in just after Labor Day. And it's an exhibition called Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. And it's not a show that we developed, but it was a show that we brought in and thought was a very important show. And it opened at the same time as the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. But it was also coming into a very polarized world in which we all live in today. So, how do you present material that can engage broad audiences in a polarized world? So, one of the things that we did, in addition to presenting that exhibition, and by the way, also having important collections and representation of Islamic art and culture, because we're an institution that has this breadth, we created these 5 what we called connection stations that are located in different galleries around the museum and had different kinds of ways of getting people to recognize that as individuals, what are our own particular perspectives and biases, using objects from the collection and interactives to sort of help people to think about, yes, my perspective is different from somebody else's, particularly if we come from different backgrounds, and how do we use that to both understand the world around us and also to bridge difference. And so that's just one small project, but it was really helpful to have developed that piece as part of the larger project. And I will say the exhibition itself is now closed, but these connection stations live on in the museum. People, there's a place for people to write comments about their experience. We're going to travel them, but it's asking the question, how can a museum work constructively around perspectives and create a sense of welcome and engagement in a world in which people are coming through our doors with all sorts of different backgrounds and perspectives.
And I love the point that was embedded there. You're talking about different modalities. You're talking about there's an object that is on display, so you have to set that up and you have to protect the object and so on. You're talking about these connection stations, which will have different components, physical and technological components, perhaps. You're talking about programming, which includes interactive presentations with people who are experts talking with non-experts. You're talking about labels. You're talking about books and monographs and speeches. So what you're doing is you're knitting together all these elements. You're actually producing a performance, aren't you? In a sense, right? You have you have your physical space. It's almost like a theatrical edutainment experience. It's not simply walking through galleries and saying, that's interesting, and just reading the label.
Part of what you're describing is an observation that we want people to experience our exhibitions, our galleries, not just with their minds, but with their hearts. And we want it to be an experience that has emotion, as whether people are conscious of it is a different question, but have an emotional reaction and recognize most people visit museums with other people. So it's a multi-part conversation between objects, experiences, friends, family members, and we need to cultivate all of that. And then back to your question about exhibitions, we absolutely use what we call, we use the word you use, we call it a portfolio of exhibitions, where we're thinking at any given time, what are the different projects that we are doing across a year, or sometimes we look across a 3-year lens, and how do we make sure that we have exhibitions that are going to engage different audiences, that create different experiences, some of which are going to have broad popular appeal, like that shark show that I mentioned, some of which may be a narrow exhibition that will really engage and excite a more connoisseur audience. Some of them are made for multi-generational experience, some for contemplation. All of that we bring into thinking about what makes a successful portfolio of exhibitions. And that's really, I think, back to what works. I think that's what we found to be very successful.
So you've had experiences in natural history settings, in natural history museums. You've had experience at the Peabody Essex Museum, a truly broad collection, Asian export art, also the old maritime art collections. You had historic buildings that were under the administration of the Peabody Essex Museum. From the point of view of somebody shaping these experiences, do you think that this variety of your own experience has helped you create this multidimensional connection between your public and this museum? Because you're not just one thing. It must be very difficult for somebody coming into this institution from the same environment over and over and over again, maybe career stints that have unfolded at the same types of institutions 3 or 4 times. That's not your career. You've got a really interesting diversity of experiences that equips you to talk about and to stage exhibitions on these various different topics. How do you see that in terms of, your career having, without really thinking about it in those terms when you took the job? It kind of is a perfect shape for this type of an institution.
Well, to some degree, I did acknowledge that as someone who, I mean, my first major museum job was heading the exhibition program at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So that's a very fine arts context. So they have broad collections. You're right, or spent time at Harvard in the Natural History Museum, Peabody Essex, that's sort of multi-platform, and ROM, again, this very wide breadth. But I think you can ask, what is it when it comes to exhibition, interpretation, presentation that fine arts museums do extremely well? What is it that natural history museums do extremely well? How do we take things sort of out of their typological place? I mean, I love the fact, for instance, that natural history museums often have hands-on activities in galleries that create experiences because we're familiar and people are comfortable with that with a natural history or science or nature setting. You don't see that as much as fine arts. So we break that mold and say, okay, how do we create a hands-on experience in a traditional paintings gallery? Not, of course, touching the paintings, but what other experiences that we can produce? What are the pigments that get used? How do you think about layering paint? Any number of things that really get at, or what is, in our our Flemish Masterworks painting show right now, we have put not eyeglasses. We'll have to cut this piece out. But we have put magnifying lenses, handheld magnifying lenses in different places, because when you're looking at some of these paintings, you want to be able to get up close, and particularly for kids, to see what's going on in them. And so we invite people, carefully, of course, to take those magnifying glasses. And it was designed really for kids, but, mostly what works for kids works for adults too. And so you take the magnifying glass and you can see the little figure of a man who's falling over on the ice or whatever it may actually be, and get up close and personal. So I like that idea of taking the best the best tools from different types of museums and putting them to work.
I love the example. Right? You've always been a natural sort of cross-fertilizing type of person. You don't think conventionally within boxes. And I love that example because you're taking an approach out of one environment, applying it to another environment. And it almost is like, yes, of course, we should have that kind of a fun kind of an activity, carefully executed, where people can actually zoom in and see actually the technique, the brush strokes. How do you create this little tiny figure with character and sometimes with a sense of humor, right? Because that was part of
that work has a definite sense of humor. And not that idea is necessarily exceptionally groundbreaking, but doing that all over the museum changes the dynamic and breaks down the barriers of people saying, oh, I have to act a certain way or respond a certain way, or making certain things uncomfortable for kids and families and other things. Like we definitely want kids and families everywhere in the museum. We don't only want them in the Batcave, for instance, which is another of our installations. And that's part of what has led ROM to be the most visited museum in the country. And over my time here, we've been able to increase attendance despite pandemic by more than a third. So we're, at about,
it's really amazing.
Well over 1 million people a year, heading toward 1.2 million. And one year we had almost 1.5 million. And I think that's because we do things that people care about and find exciting and engaging. But is absolutely grounded in the best science, the best insight from our many PhD experts. So just because you're trying to make it accessible and engaging doesn't mean that you make it free from having deep curatorial expertise involved.
Well, one of the things that I remembered, and I want to ask you about this, you and I had one of our conversations. I was in Boston. It was freezing cold. I ducked into an ATM thing just to get out of the weather so I could chat with you. And we were talking about your concern about the Canadian culture, museum culture, and organizational culture. Was it going to be different and offer some unique challenges? And then you also pointed out, it could, but it could also offer some unique opportunities. Do you find that there's a difference in terms of management culture, collaborative culture, institutional leadership culture that attaches to a Toronto institution versus a Boston institution, or versus a New York institution, or an LA institution? Do you feel that worry actually? How do you? What was there any cause for concern? How do you process that now in terms of how museums are run in the different countries?
Well, there certainly are differences in museums in different countries in terms of how they're run. I think some of my questions were quickly answered because, in fact, there are a lot of similarities of temperament between Toronto and Boston, and I've really enjoyed being here in Toronto, which is an amazing city. And along the way, have become a Canadian citizen, so I'm delighted to be a dual citizen, and that's been a really nice part of this experience. I would say also one of the differences, people would talk about the fact that philanthropy is different in the different countries, and it usually is expressed in a sort of a disparaging of Canadian philanthropy. But in fact, I've had the pleasure of meeting, amazing philanthropists who have been tremendously committed to ROM and giving at very high levels. So we've had gifts of $30 and $40 and $50 million over the last handful of years, as well as many people giving at different levels that also make a difference. But so I think that I've seen a lot of similarity more than difference. But one difference I do want to point out is that in Canada, many, if not most, of the large-scale museums like the ROM are significantly supported by the province and connected to the province that they're in, or the federal government if they're in Ottawa. So at ROM, for instance, we're both a freestanding charitable organization, so what in the States would be a 501c3, but we're also an agency of the province of Ontario. And so we have this deep connectivity to the province and to the provincial government. And so I will say that was unfamiliar to me. There, of course, are museums in the States that, in Washington that are connected to the federal government, or in different cities or states that are connected to, city government or county government, but it's less common in the States. And that was a learning experience for me to understand what it meant to be part of a connectivity to the province of Ontario. And that means that we need, as a museum, to follow all the regulatory expectations of an actual arm of government. We're not an actual arm, but that's, we're an agency. So that's been interesting. And I would say that Canadian museums fit somewhere in between. If you sort of think of U.S. museums, most of which are private institutions that are heavily funded by philanthropy and endowments, at least the larger and older ones, and you think about European museums, most of which are part of government and almost completely supported by government, sort of Canada sits somewhere in the middle. By the way, not just in terms of how museums are run, but in a lot of other ways. And that's really a nice place to be. You have the benefit of significant private philanthropy, but you also have very important engagement and support from government.
My observation about the advantages of the model that Canada uses is that there are times when philanthropy waxes and wanes. There are times when audiences wax and wane. And the diversity of support ensure that these institutions remain strong at the times when they need to remain strong in the face of certain challenges, And since they are really incredible economic drivers within cities, I mean, 1 million people coming to your doors, that has a real knock-on effect on businesses, restaurants, the downtown area. You don't get deserted deserts in the downtown during hard times because of institutions like yours. There's a public interest in that. On the other hand, you are not so complacently funded by government that you can sit on your laurels. You actually have a dual governance board. Talk a little bit about how that dual governance board functions, because that's a very interesting model that you have.
It is, and it's not unusual in Canada, though it's rarer again in the States. But we have the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM, and I report to a fiduciary board. It has 21 members. 16 of those members are appointed by the provincial government. So they're government appointees, and 4 are member elected. So they are elected by the membership of ROM. And then the University of Toronto, you mentioned that historic relationship with the University of Toronto. So there's a University of Toronto, the president of the university and their delegate sits on our board as well. So that's the fiduciary board, and they're involved in the traditional activities of oversight of day-to-day and finances. And then we have a supporting foundation called ROM Governors. And it's a separate organizational structure. They're located here in the same building as we, and they have their own president and CEO. And there is a board of about up to 35 members on that. And that tends to be made up of board members of the sort that you would see in a traditional large U.S. museum, which is to say major philanthropists and corporate leaders. And that's in effect, a fundraising board. Their job is to provide the philanthropic support that allows the museum to thrive. And that works really well in terms of creating a very strong environment of philanthropy while we still have the support from government. But it also means that if you're in the seat that I'm in as CEO, I have 2 boards that I basically, directly or indirectly report to. And then we have the Minister of Tourism, Culture, and Gaming, who I indirectly have to be responsible to because I'm stewarding an asset that the province is, an agency that the province is directly engaged in. So it is a complex organizational, governance structure. And I think people in this role have to acknowledge, one of the things I realized early on is the Board of Governors I don't report to the Board of Governors, but they are so crucial to what we're doing. So I have to think and feel as if I do. And I think that's been a hallmark of success, is saying all 3 of these parts of the legs of the stool, it's critical that I see as crucial and that I have and our team has a direct relationship with and involvement with. The one thing I will say, and I was mentioning this to someone recently, is here in Canada, I'm glad to say, while government is very involved in supporting the finances and overseeing the ensuring the success of the institution and our efficiency and our effectiveness, they keep arm's distance from anything to do with the program. So the provincial government does not, and expressly does not, get involved in choices about exhibitions or programs or strategy in that regard. And that's very important, that sort of separation, which I know is an issue on the minds of many U.S. leaders right now.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. We're coming to the end of our time here. I want to point out, though, something that you said, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the future that you envision for the institution. You basically gave a fabulous description of the various competencies that a leader of this type of an institution needs to bring to the table. You talked about the knowledge of the collections. You talked about an understanding of the audience. You talked about an understanding of how to balance a portfolio of exhibitions and programs. You also talked about financial management. You talked about pulling together staff. You talked about relationships amongst different institutions, whether they're governmental, university, or other partner institutions. You talked about being able to balance the board and being finding yourself accountable, both in a direct reporting relationship and one that you've basically taken on because it's so important to have the Board of Governors be supportive and read in on your plans. So one of the things that as a recruiter that I confront is this idea that all museum directors are created in the same mold. And they're just not, right? I mean, different institutions require and different communities require leaders with fundamentally different skill sets.
And I think I agree with you. And certainly a large, complex municipal museum requires many of the sorts of things that we were just talking about because you're balancing a whole range of portfolios. You have to care about and be engaged. You know, I for my first few years here, I sat on the committee for every curatorial hire we made, that I approve every acquisition or at least major acquisition that we're involved in, that they're the governance elements and fundraising and financial, which is not to say, by the way, that everybody is equally expert at every aspect of that portfolio because we're all human. And, you know, I know when I do a search with you, Mark, I say, find me someone who walks on water. And there aren't too many of those to be found. But in any event, I think people have to have some meaningful degree of aptitude in a large, complex institution, that it can't just be on one side of the house or another. So that feels important. And, you know, one project that I think is worth mentioning that it sort of gets to, again, another thing that you have to do to bring pieces together. If you talk about moving an institution forward, and as I look back on 10 years at ROM, the biggest project that I have been involved in conceiving of and moving forward is a project that we call Open ROM, which is a physical transformation of the building. It's a $130 million construction project, about $160 million when you bring in some endowments and programmatic activities. And it is about how do we ensure that the building actually meets the needs of the strategy and the vision.
See, I love this. What you're doing is you're re-architecting, but from an artistic utilitarian perspective of how you're walking through an architect's mind, a team's mind, and experiencing that, right? The Open ROM concept is so interesting. Keep describing it because it's really fascinating.
Well, it started from our strategic commitment to say, how can the ROM be an even more cultural and civic hub and a place of gathering, a town hall for the people of Toronto and beyond? What does it mean? What would it take to do that? And a variety of strategies. But one of them is to change the way people engage with our building and our physical plant. The crystal that we talked about before is a remarkable piece of sculptural architecture, but it's not always the most welcoming space, and it didn't necessarily invite people in. And so we connected with a terrific Toronto architect, Siamak Hariri, and we said, how can we develop a project that helps us achieve that goal? So it's not to use something, I didn't make this up, but we're not interested in just an edifice complex. We're not interested in just building for the sake of building. We're interested in how a building serves the mission. And so this project has three basic areas. One is design and architecture. How do we make it more welcoming, more open, bring in more natural light, and address some basic utilitarian issues like the fact that on the front of our building, we have these wonderful sides of the crystal that historically, when the snow and ice is falling down, we'd have to carve out different areas so that they avoided the inclement weather. So how do we address that with this, we're creating this beautiful bronze canopy that's really terrific. Or when people would say, I come in, I can't see, my guests are coming, I can't see out the front. So how do we bring a way to see in and out? How do we say when you come in the Bloor Street entrance, you can actually say it's not just a great piece of architecture, but I see remarkable objects. I see a 2-ton geode. I see an extraordinary ancient bronze bell that stands 10 feet high. How do I know I'm in a museum right off the bat? So there's the architecture issue. there is programming. I believe that we're not only about just those exhibitions and galleries, as important as they are, but how can we bring performance and dance and music and other types of performative activity into the heart of the museum, right in the middle there. And then the third one is access. And I know that some museums have the good fortune that they don't have to charge a ticket price. We charge a ticket price. It's part of our financial model. But it means that some people are priced out of the ability to come with their families. So we were able to get a remarkable philanthropic family, the Temerty Foundation, to give us a $30 million endowment for a program that we call Free Main Floor. And when this project is done, the entire ground floor of the museum, that'll be about 100,000 square feet, will be free and open to all without any ticket barrier, where they can experience the galleries, they can sit in the cafe and have a cup of coffee, they can shop in the retail, and they can see performance. So that's if I said the single thing that I probably am most excited that I've been able to do with a wonderful team here is to make Open ROM possible.
Well, it actually does point to the future. It answers that second part of the question, right? It's really about accessibility. It's about responsiveness. It's creating an experience before you ever walk in the door, basically grabbing people as they're walking by because of the way you're reshaping that sort of visual and physical space. And the thing that I really, really appreciate about what you've done is if you take a look at where you were in 2015, the year before you came, you come on 2016, you walk through those doors, and as the plans for Open ROM come to fruition, the people who can walk through those doors and how they're invited in are going to have a fundamentally transformed and upgraded experience with much the same collections, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a different, you're gaining more access to this wonder that is within your doors, within your environment. And that really is about your leadership. It's your people's leadership. It's your team. It's the board of governors. It's your partners. That is the collaboration which has been so enormously fruitful. I think you can be so proud, Josh, of what you all have accomplished. I've watched and benefited from it, sometimes near, sometimes from afar. Congratulations, really, congratulations. And please thank everybody for what they've done for the world and for Toronto.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I agree with you. It is a team effort, a lot of people pulling in the right direction. Our first piece of this Open ROM project, which is a expanded dinosaur gallery, actually opened today. So I will be leaving with that first piece done. Much of the rest will be opening later in 2026. But I know also, and I said this again now, my last speech, which I made about 10 days ago, is I said there's so much ahead for this institution, so many exciting directions for the museum to be going in and making a difference in people's lives, and I will look forward to cheering from the bench. So as I watch all this work go forward.
Well, thank you so much, Josh Basseches, Director and CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum. It's just been magnificent. Thank you so much for sharing the work that you've done. I think it's very instructive for anyone who is leading an institution and is trying to ensure that these institutions remain vital. So important for our urban centers and for our countries and internationally for binding people together and creating connection. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.